what do we have in this assignment? Well, we have in front of us a rig that's a little more complex than what we've used before. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of the rig, how to work with it. But just like I was asking people, what would you animate first, right? The rider on the horse or the horse, if you'd animate the horse. So in this case, what we're going to animate is we're going to animate the character first. That has to bounce. So we need to do our bouncing ball. That has to work first before you touch the tail at all. There's no point doing this because the tail depends on what you do with the character. If I grab this thing and throw it across screen, that's going to mean the tail has to do something different than bouncing and jumping from platform to platform. Okay, so we're going to animate that first. I have an example as well of what this is going to look like. So if you look at the demo, here is the example. Okay, now here's the clip. So this is what we're going to do. This is a nice example to look at. And the requirements for the assignment are that you must have the same or similar contact points that you see in the example. So the only direction that I'm giving in terms of the animation is the character must jump from here to here. It must do that. It then has to jump from here and it must hit the ground. It has to land somewhere here. And then it has to jump back up, land here, and then it must jump off screen. So these are all mandatory. You have to do that. You cannot choose your own path. I don't want anyone doing this and jumping here, doing that, jumping this, and then doing that. Okay? This is 67 frames. So we're hitting almost 3 seconds of animation. And that's not a huge number of frames to have to worry about. And you also have the option to do the director's cut. You can do a version of this where you can ignore all the rules and just have fun. That's great. I just won't grade it. Now, the other thing, if you look at the example, you'll see that one of the things that we're doing differently is this is a character. It is not just a ball, just a toy, right? Just an inanimate object. So with a character has to prepare, right? So we call that an anticipation. So what we're doing here is kind of a squash. It needs to prepare to jump, just like the squirrel was squashing up before it stretched. So this is the jump. We need to prepare. So you can see that we're using a bit of time to prepare. And we're also using stretch. So very similar principles, squash and stretch. And then the character goes up in the air, right? And then they land. So what I'm going to demo is I'm going to go through just one bounce, maybe just like 1.5 bounces to get the character moving. And then I'm going to do a demo of how to approach animating the tail. Okay. But when we start approaching the tail, the most important thing to focus on is when is it easy to understand? And physics is usually very easy to understand when something goes in a straight line and is going very fast. So that's when I usually focus on stuff like this is very easy to understand. So I know if this is going down, this is going up, and it's not an S curve. Right? Same thing going up. If you jump up, right? If my direction is up, then this is down. Okay. And then when things are kind of at the high point like this, cresting over, what you tend to see is that the ball leads and the tail follows, right? And they kind of do similar things. They kind of follow the same arc, but just a little bit different. It's almost like a train going across a monorail, a nice curve. So that's all easy to understand. The part where you really get frustrated, what's really difficult is this abrupt change in direction. When everything stops, changes direction, and snaps going this way. That's the most difficult stuff. And usually there's no way you can rely on the computer for help here. This is you doing every frame because it's very, very tricky for the computer to get it right. Now let's have a look at the rig here. So I've got my Maya scene open. I'm just going to check my settings and make sure I turn everything off except curves so that when I drag everything, I'm not selecting geo, deformers, IK handles, all that other stuff. I'm just going to get out of the camera view so we can have a look at this a little more carefully. Okay. The red control at the bottom here is our main control. Let me just go over the channel box here. This main control is used to place the character and scale them, but it's not used to animate. We could pick the whole character up and move it, but that's not how the rig is built. For one thing, this is a really terrible pivot point. If you want the character to spin, they will spin at a very odd location. The pivot point will not make any sense, and you have to counter animate that. The control we're going to use to move the character is the circle around the equator. This picks up the whole character. So they're going to jump and bounce. And this red control, we're going to leave behind. We're not going to move it. We're just going to leave it alone. The only thing to note on the red control here, this triangle, is over in the channel box, you do have the option to choose 3 different types of geometry. So you can go for something simple, you can go with El Zorro, or you can go with Le Castor if you want to do something a little more Canadian here. So we leave that alone. We've got our choices locked in. Then I'm going to grab this. This is how we're going to use to move the character. There is a squash and stretch control. Okay, and again, there's no reason to go crazy with this. We just want to be able to squash and stretch. It's built there for us to use to add flexibility, show things moving. And then the tail, right? Again, we have these 4 segments, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you grab all of them at once and then hit E, you can rotate everything at once, but all this will do is curl the tail up or down. It doesn't give you any more control than that. And what I would recommend is when you're animating this, don't do anything like this or like this. There's no need. We're just basically treating this like a side-scrolling video game. It's all in one direction, so you only need to rotate in one axis. It will just make life easier. You don't want to overcomplicate the graph editor. We don't need to have the tail wag or roll in other axes. Okay, so we're just going to keep it simple, just this and this. Of course, to get a proper pose, then you would go to each individual segment and then start to rotate and move things around. You'll notice that, of course, it's a very limited rig, so it doesn't have an infinite range of movement. You can't make every pose you would like, so you have to compromise, okay? So I'm gonna move that down, maybe move that one up. Try to get kind of like a little S-curve here. If you rotate them quite a bit, you'll see there's pinching. You're gonna see this geometry will kind of cave in, and that's okay, right? I'm not gonna be worried about the rig looking amazing in every single frame, but just be aware that if you rotate these to a large degree, they will have some distortion. Okay, it's not gonna be perfect like what you can get with the drawing. If you look at the individual controls, over on the side, you can see there's 3 rotate channels. Again, I recommend just use X, just one. There's also a scale attribute, but we don't need it. I would really recommend you don't use the scale attribute. It just causes a lot of headaches later. And again, if it's something that on one frame, you change the scale, and then 100 frames later, you change the scale, the tail's just gonna morph and drift for dozens and dozens of frames, and it's gonna look really odd. It's gonna feel like it's not, you know, got a solid anatomy there, all right? So just ignore the scale and just work with the controls. Now, if you head up over to the animation shelf, VFS animation, there's a couple of scripts here that are worth noting, but I'll just show you one. One of the scripts that I have up here is called 0 channels. So when I have the tail selected, all of the connections, and I hit this button, it will just put everything to 0. It's just a handy little keyboard shortcut rather than going in and typing in 0 for all of these things. And again, it just lives here on the shelf. Right? It's not something that comes with Maya. This is a script that I found. It's free, and I added it to the shelf here. So if you want to use it, you can. If you don't have to. All you need to do is just select the 4 objects and then just go to the rotate channels and just select them all and hit 0. It does the same thing. Just to sort of start by refreshing the tail and putting it back into shape. On the main control here as well, there is a little visibility toggle. If you wanted to, you could turn the tail off. Just when you're working, say, I don't want to look at the tail, I'll just focus on the ball, right? So that option is on the red triangle, the main control. If you just want to toggle the tail visibility on and off, it's there. So that's the rig in a nutshell.